In this video, we'll discuss Mozart's Concerto for Horn in D, K412, the first movement. Specifically, we'll be looking at the first half of the first movement. So let's look at some of the big picture elements first, specifically the first three sections of a classical concerto. The first exposition, the second exposition, and then the second ritornello. The first exposition begins right away. As expected, this first exposition also features the orchestra, not the solo player. You can see here that we have the principal horn in D. This is our solo line. So if you see a C, you're going to hear a D. In other words, if you see something here, that's actually going to be a concert D. So there's two ways to think about it. Some people will just think a step up. The other way, of course, is just to read the principal horn part in alto clef. It'll give you the same thing. But in any event, this first exposition is also serving as our first ritornello, featuring the orchestra. Scanning through the piece, you can see that this score oh so helpfully marks our first solo section for us, actually. So this is the beginning of solo 1. Notice, again, this is the principal horn part in D. This is where the horn player enters for the first time. And of course, this is also serving as our second exposition. Just to draw your attention to a couple key areas, notice, as we said, this piece is in D major, and indeed the first exposition starts in D major. Scanning to the end of the first exposition, notice that we are still in D major. We went up with a perfect authentic cadence in D major. Notice that cadences, especially in orchestral pieces of this time, it's usually the string section that is serving as the primary carrier of the voice leading. The wind parts are often filling out and thickening some of the texture and adding beautiful color, but often if you're trying to figure out cadences, you can get away with looking primarily at the strings, which of course are grouped together at the bottom of the score here. As expected, that first exposition starts in D, ends in D. On to Expo 2. So Expo 2 picks up. We'll look at the thematic content in more detail later, but for right now we're just looking at big sections. The horn continues for quite a while. Notice that there are some moments where the horn player gets a few measures of rest here and there. The soloist is not obligated to play every measure of the second exposition. It'll just be the dominant voice throughout the second exposition. And especially when you're dealing with wind concertos, there's more likely to be at least a few places to provide some breathing space. Notice that when we get to the downbeat of measure 51, that this is where the horn drops out for a little while, and this is also marked for us in the score as the tutti section. This is the beginning of the second ritornello, featuring the orchestra. Notice that at this point, the piece has modulated into A major. This is a cadence in A major. Again, remembering that we're transposing, this is a trill on a B natural, going down to an A natural. So winding up with a perfect authentic cadence in A major. This was the expected key for this particular piece, because since we started in a major key, we would expect the secondary key to be the dominant. At this point, let's go back to the beginning of the movement and talk through the thematic content in more detail. As expected, the primary theme enters right at the beginning of the exposition. That kind of is what happens at the beginning of expositions. It's this beautiful melody here. Notice that it's in sentence structure. We get a 2 plus 2 plus 4 structure, right? Cadencing on the downbeat of measure 8 with this perfect authentic cadence here. Again, if you're thinking of the strings as being the primary tune carriers at that point. Notice that this is an elided cadence. It is both the end of that opening phrase and the beginning of the next phrase. This is a fairly small scale movement, so in this case we're actually already in the transition. Measure 8 starts the transition. Since this is exposition 1, we don't expect anything to modulate. This is going to stay in D major throughout, and this is a fairly short transition, a brief 4-measure segment. Notice that in measure 11, we reach a half cadence, followed by a drastic drop in texture. Even though there's not a literal silence due to the pickup into the next phrase, this serves as the medial caesura of the piece, the MC. We pick up with this wonderfully perky tune starting in measure 12. This is the S theme. There's no reason you would know this yet, but since there will be changes later in the piece, I'm going to go ahead and call this S1. But for right now, we just know that we've reached the secondary theme zone. with this lovely tune carried by the first violins, reaching a perfect authentic cadence on the last beat of measure 15. Now, this could have closed S. This could have served as the end of our secondary theme, heralding the arrival of the closing theme in the next measure. However, if you listen to this carefully, you'll notice that immediately that tune that we just heard is repeated. So compare with me measure 12, that first violin part, to what happens in measure 16. The orchestration is a lot thicker, and what had been in the first violin gets taken over by the second violin here. But it's the same tune, which means we're still in the secondary theme area. So the question then becomes, where does S end? This piece reaches a perfect authentic cadence in the middle of measure 19. And that indeed is what closes down the secondary theme. Notice that after that, this becomes a bunch of 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1 gesture that's very typical of a codetta-like closing theme, thus ending the exposition with that perfect authentic cadence. The exciting thing about reaching the second exposition is that, first of all, we get to hear the soloist enter for the first time. And then secondly, it doesn't necessarily have to follow the first exposition exactly in terms of thematic content. And third, of course, the second exposition will feature a modulation. Looking at the beginning here, this is the same primary theme that was used in the first exposition. So if you compare measure 22 with what happened at the very beginning of the piece, obviously they're in, since we're looking at the transposing horn, it looks a tiny bit different, but it's the same tune at the same pitch level, actually. It's just written because for the transposing instrument, of course. So picks up with the primary theme, the original primary theme there. Same sentence structure that we had before, dee-da, dee-da-da-da-da, dee-da-dum. 2-bar basic idea, 2-bar basic idea, 4-bar continuation, leading us into the perfect authentic cadence on the downbeat of 29. As before, this marks the beginning of transition. There's a couple ways you could mark this transition. If you listen carefully, this is not the same as the first exposition, but it's also not completely different. So this motive in particular that we have in the first violin should sound familiar. It's very similar to what happens in the first violin in measure 8. However, that material is interspersed with new material. So for right now, I'm going to go ahead and call this transition 1 versus transition 2. It would also be fine if you called it transition and then transition prime. There's some similarities, but there's enough new content that is really splitting hairs arguing which of those terms is better, but either is acceptable in this case. In any event, we're combining that arpeggiated figure from the violins interspersed with commentary from the horn, which is kind of fun, that little back and forth that happens one measure at a time. Violin versus horn, violin versus horn, violin versus horn. Notice that by this point, the piece has started introducing a lot of G sharps. Notice that there are a lot of G sharps on this page. And by the time we get to the end of this section, we're really trying to figure out, okay, how is this transition going to end? At the top of the next page, notice this arrival on an E major chord. E major, of course, is functioning as a 5 chord in the key of A major. So this is a half cadence, but it's a half cadence in the dominant key of A major. So this transition in the second exposition did modulate, and that's fairly common that that transition will modulate, and as this is serving as the connection to get us into the secondary key. This, of course, is S. However, this is not the same S as was present in the first exposition. So we have these 16th notes followed by 8ths, just as a reminder of the comparison going back to, what was it, measure 12. It's not the same tune at all, not even the same rhythmic values in this case. So we're going to call the one from exposition S1 and this one from exposition 2 S2, just to differentiate the two in this case. This S theme is in sentence structure. We have a 2-bar basic idea, a 2-bar basic idea, a continuation that begins in the last measure of that system. I'll go ahead and mark these in here. Since we had a 4-bar presentation, this leads us to expect a 4-bar continuation. So 1, 2, 3, 4 bars. It actually seems to be pushing into the next downbeat, but lo and behold, this is not a tonic chord in A major. Specifically, this is a 6th chord. And the harmony here is interesting and typical of a gesture where the composer doesn't quite want to end the section yet and wants to have a second pass at something, which is exactly what happens in the next few measures. So starting in measure, for instance, let's see, 49, 48, 47. Measure 47 is essentially a second pass to the continuation. It's a little bit elaborated, but if you compare what happens here to what happens starting in measure 42, you can hear the similarities in the recording. And the second pass to the continuation is the one that manages to reach the perfect authentic cadence in A major. Notice that this is the perfect authentic cadence that closes down the secondary theme, so this is the one that is serving as EEC in this case. Notice that the second exposition does not have a closing theme. We go directly into the second ritornello without having closing theme in the exposition proper. All right, to return to that interesting moment around 44 or so, just to do a quick harmonic analysis, we've got a 2-6-5, intensifying to a secondary dominant, specifically a 5-6-5 of 5, going to a cadential 6-4. And so up until this point, this really could have been cadential 6-4, 5-7-1, reaching that expected perfect authentic cadence on this next downbeat. But instead, we get that elaborate path towards the deceptive cadence, specifically passing up chromatically through a 7 diminished 7 of 6. In order to reach that 6th chord there for the deceptive cadence. It's quite beautiful. So that's the end of Expo 2. Looking at Ritornello 2. Ritornello 2, again, could pull from any number of sections. In this case, this Ritornello 2 features that arpeggiation motive that was from the first transition initially, so this is TR based. Cadencing in 55, and then reaching that more emphatic cadence in 61, kicking off the beginning of the development. So, typical things about this that we've talked about so far. Exposition 1 has all 4 thematic zones. Exposition 1 does not modulate. We have P, TR, MC, S, our secondary theme, and the closing theme. And one thing I neglected to mention earlier is this is our pseudo EEC, EEC in scare quotes. What I mean by that is the perfect authentic cadence that closes down the S, but since S is still in tonic, it's not quite as significant as the true EEC that happens in Expo 2. Closing theme, Exposition 2 introduces the soloist. P tracks exactly with Expo 1. TR introduces a few new elements, but still incorporates motives from Expo 1. And it's really not until the S theme that the soloist insists on introducing new material to differentiate itself from the original exposition. Using that beautiful expansion that we talked about in the latter half of that to reach the EEC in measure 51. Ritornello 2 then picks up with material based on the transition, confirming that dominant key through a couple cadences and concluding in measure 61.